It's fair to say that in the history of Starfleet there are but a handful of famous starship designs that really just stand high above their contemporaries. In fact, these ships are often so popular that they often acquire a cult-like status among their crews and officers, who tend to go on and form informal groups around their love and affection for that design and seek to propagate such designs to ensure that future generations enjoy the same great starships that they knew as young officers. We've discussed this kind of phenomenon previously with regards to the Excelsior Mafia. However, the Excelsior Mafia was hardly the first group of its kind. Old ideas tend to die pretty hard deaths, and there is perhaps no better example of an old idea dying a hard death than the Vesper Class. Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and yes, today we are going to be talking about the Vesper Class and the sordid story behind its design and why it doesn't actually ever enter service. So, without any further ado, let's begin. So, I think the first thing we need to look at is we need to ask, where does the Vesper come from in its inception? What was the initial idea that spawned the Vesper Class? So, during the 2280s, there was the Excelsior program, which you will remember was quite the painful development cycles. It was perhaps one of the most infamous development hells in all of Starfleet history. So, while that was going on, Starfleet began looking for stopgaps and alternatives. Basically, the idea is, well, we want to replace the Constitution class with the Excelsior class, but the Excelsior isn't ready, but the Constitution is really looking quite aged at this point, and certainly even comparing it to Andors and Constellations, trust me, it loses out in almost every single department. And so, various ideas were considered for replacing the Constitution. One of these ideas was the Shangri-La class. This was an incremental evolution of the Constitution class, and took it more to be a torpedo cruiser with, instead of dual torpedo launchers, triple torpedo launchers. It also had a much more sleek and streamlined profile. It would have been a lot faster and more maneuverable than the Constitution, which actually was pretty pathetic in those departments. However, another idea was also put forward by another branch of Starfleet's Admiralty, and that was for the Vesper class. This was merely an initial design sketch/concept, and this was the idea of basically building the Constitution, but smaller, lighter, and cheaper. They built a prototype, and it was rejected. Now, this idea would be pushed forward again in 2315, as Excelsior is now getting on a bit and they're looking at building a new flagship class, what would eventually become the Ambassador class, and they submitted to this competition the Vesper again. And this time they had given it, begrudgingly, some phaser arrays. Yet again it was rejected in favour of the Renaissance concept, which eventually, of course, became the Ambassador class. The Vesper class is really the pet of the Connie Mafia, the Blitz fighter of the Connie Mafia. This is the ship they kept trying to get into service, and literally no one had any interest in it. And actually, the origins of this idea go even further back than even the Constitution class, all the way back to the turn of the 23rd century. So really the originator of the Constitution Mafia is a guy called Jules Barraud, an Andorian captain, and he was a hero of the 4 Years' War. He commanded the USS Isa, an Asia-class light cruiser. Now, the Asia class was built at the turn of the 23rd century, and at the time, it was absolutely a revolutionary cutting-edge design. You've got to bear in mind that prior to the Asia class, the mainline cruiser of Starfleet was the Rockwell class, and you can probably see already quite the substantial difference between the two. So the Asia class introduces this revolutionary new design, the idea of a split hull design. That had been toyed with before, but the Asia class really goes for it, and the idea of creating a cruiser that is extremely capable of long-range cruising, super cruising. This was able to comfortably cruise at warp 6 and punch up as high as warp 7. The compromise that the Asia class made in return for its incredible levels of speed was that it was only ever armed with lasers and photonic torpedoes. This was an exploration ship through and through. In fact, it was extremely lightly armed, and arguably that's probably the reason why later starships, like the Constitution, would be far better armed, because while the Asia class achieved much, it also cost Starfleet a lot in terms of the lives of its crews, since it was not unknown or unusual for Asia class ships to simply disappear without a trace. But it was a highly prolific and highly successful class of ship, and it would go on to see service after a refit in the 4 Years' War. At this point, it's serving more as a second-line cruiser. In the front-line role, it's been replaced by the Jovia class, which is technically speaking a medium cruiser, even among its contemporaries. A brief touch on the Jovia class, actually. As I say, it falls into the role of a medium cruiser, and what you see in the course of the 4 Years' War is that actually a medium cruiser is kind of no good to anyone. It's too slow to keep up with lights, and it's too light to hang with the heavies. And so it really falls into this unfortunate spot, and so Jovia class ships did not do well in the 4 Years' War. However, going back to the Asia class, that did incredibly well in the 4 Years' War. It did an awful lot of reconnaissance and screening duties, and would see refits and upgrades, and as previously mentioned, it was refitted to make it at least somewhat combat effective in the 4 Years' War. Now, that does not mean it was particularly powerful, by no means. It was vulnerable to almost any Klingon ship of the period. But it was fast, it was maneuverable, and it had a powerful suite of sensors to boot as well. So there was a lot of good things that it could do. So Captain Jarl Borld would carry out a legendary raid on a Klingon supply depot. He managed to somehow, with his ship armed with lasers and photonic torpedoes, defeat several Klingon ships, granted probably older ships. Now I might cover this battle another time, possibly in the 4 Years' War or possibly in a separate battle breakdown, we'll see. So because of this, because in this reconnaissance cruiser, for all intents and purposes, he had been able to launch a devastating attack on a Klingon outpost, he was, well, venerated as a war hero, and after the war, he would become an academy instructor and basically milked his fame for all that it was worth. And of course, he would then preach the word of the Asia class to his students. At the time, actually, he railed against the Constitution because the Constitution was a heavy cruiser, and how dare the successor of the Asia class be a heavy cruiser? It should be a light cruiser that completely betrays the Asia class. Then, once Constitution had been in service a couple of years, he then found a new target in the form of the Excelsior, railed against that well into his retirement. And instead the Constitution class became the ultimate embodiment of the Asia class, rather than a evolution and development further down the line. It was viewed as what the Asia was destined to be. And forget that most of the Constitution's design qualities was a response to the weaknesses of the Jovia class. Thus, the Constitution Mafia was born, and they would fight tooth and nail over the next few decades to keep the Constitution in service at all costs. They were the ones behind the Constitution refit. Hell, they even tried to get the Asia class a third refit in the 2270s. And they fought the Excelsior program and all it represented, tooth and nail. Their secret weapon against the menace of modern, overcomplicated technology was the Vesper Class, the ultimate in elegant, simple design. Or that's what they said. The Vesper Class is 317 meters long, 120 meters wide and 68 meters tall. It is armed with 3 laser or later phaser batteries, push came to shove, and a single aft torpedo launcher. It has 2 impulse units mounted on the saucer with 2 impulse reactors. It has a horizontal warp core because the vertical warp core is a stupid fad and it's hideously vulnerable, of course. Why would you have a more powerful power plant when the old one's perfectly fine and it's far less vulnerable than this vertical warp core nonsense? That'll never catch on. And for some reason it has these weird tapered warp nacelles. I don't know, there was something about some scientific paper saying that warp ruined subspace. I don't know, that sounds like a load of hippie nonsense to me. And that's kind of it. It gets phaser arrays in 2315 when they try to pose it as an alternative to the Ambassador class, but yeah, that's the Vesper class. It is the ultimate in keep it simple stupid, with heavy emphasis on the stupid. So what was the idea behind it? How did they pitch this to Starfleet? Well, basically, the pitch behind it was, well, I'll let them do it. Right, so if we go with the... Not again.
Yes,
not
excuse me, pardon me. Yes, good afternoon, gentlemen. I am Vice Admiral Flock, and I am here today to present to you the future of Starfleet. The Vesper Class cruiser, yes. It's going to lead the Federation into military parity with the Klingon Defense Force. For the first time in Starfleet's existence, we can outnumber the Klingons. You see, the Klingons, they have historically had more ships than we have, so that we have had to rely on our cunning and our skill and on our technological edge where we have it. But you see, now we can have that in spades. The Vesper, unlike the clumsy new Excelsior, which is burning time that we simply do not have, the Vesper will rely on what we already know and perfect it. We will hone it into a keen edge with which to point at the Klingons.
What reliable technology would that be, sir?
Ah, yes, the venerable and well-respected Constitution Class cruiser.
Of course.
That is why you are wasting materials trying to redesign absolute perfection. But
where the hell
we can improve upon perfection, you see. Yes, we are Starfleet. Our technological know-how from the Federation will far surpass anyone else in the galaxy, but if we base that on reliable, known technology, then you see we will have a solid foundation with which to improve, yes. As I've mentioned, the Klingons have historically had a numerical advantage over Starfleet, but now we can outnumber the Klingons with these fearless captains and their capable crews in ships that they are already qualified to operate. Yes.
So what weapon systems did you have in mind for this, sir?
You see, the Klingons are familiar with our phasers, but they will not be expecting us to use lasers, and therefore that will give us a decisive tactical edge. Yes. And then we can have swarms of Vespers that will surround these battleships outside of their firing range and simply pelt them to death with lasers. That is where the brilliance of the Vesper comes through. It is all technology that we already have access to, employed in creative new ways. So the Klingons will not be expecting us to utilize this older technology in such an efficient and practical manner. And that's why the Vesper will be the future of Starfleet, unlike this silly Excelsior, which will never go anywhere and is simply wasting time and resources.
So basically the idea of the Vesper class was that it was going to outnumber the Klingons, even though the Klingons were themselves racing to build ships that were cheaper than the D7. The Katinga was a cheaper, more economical development of the D7 that they could produce en masse, Starfleet was going to beat that by also doing a cheaper, more economical development of the Constitution in order to beat the enemy en masse. And thus we would presumably end up with a colossal demolition derby. The idea was to try and reclaim speed and mobility from the Klingons, forgetting the fact that for most of history Starfleet has always suffered from a disadvantage in speed and mobility when fighting the Klingons. That's just how things are. The other idea was that it would allow their most bold and exceptional officers to fight their way to the top, or die trying. A similar kind of philosophy to the Imperial TIE Fighters from Star Wars. The idea of it's very simple to use, it's very cheap to produce, but it's got a high skill ceiling. So we'll quickly be able to pick out the skilled pilots from the unskilled pilots, because the unskilled pilots are going to be dead. And then anyone who's still alive, we can assume, is a good pilot, and we can start promoting them up the chain until they eventually themselves die. So I think the best way to describe the thinking, the mentality behind the Vesper class is trying to extinguish a fire by throwing petrol on it. It should be no surprise, of course, that the Vesper class was wholesale rejected by Starfleet both times. It was rejected in favour of the Shangri-La, in favour of the Excelsior, in favour of the Renaissance, in favour of the Ambassador. And it just really goes to show the dangers of mythology. You can take this historical event, this fantastic story, and you can believe that it is the rule. You can believe that exceptions are in fact the rules. In the case of, for example, torpedo rams. Torpedo rams are a class of ships that basically spawn mostly from the Battle of Lissa. Correct me if I'm wrong, people, naval historians, Drakinafel, but it seems that they basically come about as a result of, well, we're very new to this whole ironclad thing. There was one battle with ironclads where ramming happened, so in the ironclad era, ramming must be a thing. Taking an exception and believing it to be a rule. And of course, torpedo rams were not produced in great numbers, fortunately, and didn't see any action in their time period, and were all decommissioned, as the dead-end designs that they were. In the best-case scenario, things like the Vesper class are essentially old men yelling at a cloud. Someone believing in their own historical mythology, huffing their own farts, believing their own propaganda, comes in and said, "I've designed a thing!" And everyone just turns around, looks at them for a second and says, "Who are you? And can you please get out of our office?" That's your best case scenario. Your worst case scenario is that those ideas, that mythology, that propaganda is actually bought into. I mean, just imagine if that happened. I mean, that could never possibly happen. No military would be foolish enough to spend 50 years huffing its own farts and believing its own propaganda, only to immediately be hit with a brick wall of reality. That's purely fictional. Fundamentally, it comes from a theoretical approach to starship combat, a theoretical approach to design and doctrine. This is all something that looks good in theory, but would not measure up in any form of reality. And so really, I think the thing that the Vesper best shows is just how far, in only 100 years, Starfleet had come. By trying to bring the past to the modern day, it just went to show how far Starfleet had advanced, and how far we've moved on from those glory days which, as great as they were, are indeed in the past, and they should remain there. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and I will see you all in the next video.